A very critical situation there, and one of the key issues emerging from the Libyan conflict is a lack of humanitarian aid for residents trapped in towns like Misurata. Now, the European Union says it's prepared to send up to 1,000 soldiers to Libya on a humanitarian mission if requested by the United Nations. Well, the European Union's foreign policy chief is Catherine Ashton. She's here in the studio with us. Welcome to Al Jazeera. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Tell us more first about this plan to deploy troops to Libya. It would be on a humanitarian mission, I understand. When is this likely to happen, and what's the scope of the mission going to be?
Well, you know, it's really important when trying to look at how to support the people of Libya that we are prepared for all sorts of possibilities. So what I've asked the European Union staff to do is to work up a plan that, as you've absolutely rightly said, would only happen if, and it's a big if, the United Nations felt this was necessary. When we've looked back on some of the situations of the past, whether it's natural disasters or other times of conflict, sometimes having what we call military assets, the capacity to get into a port when there aren't the usual port equipment isn't available and so on, to be able to support aid in. So we've been looking at how do we put a plan together that we could put into action if necessary.
Where would this force come from? Because there seems to have been a lack of consensus even within the European Union as to how to move forward with Libya. We've seen Germany reluctant even with the bombing campaign over Libya. Are the Germans on board with this idea, and where would this force come from?
All 27 member states support the idea of planning for the possibility of needing to help with a UN aid mission. That's what we've been doing. My job is, as High Representative, to kind of lead that planning operation. So it's with the support of all member states. We may not need it, but you and I both know that the situation could reach a point where we'd be asked to move quickly, and I wanted to make sure we could.
Again, what is the scope of the mission going to be? Would they be engaged in combat operations, for instance?
It's purely about how do you get aid into particular places. If we think about Misurata, trying to make sure that you could physically get the aid in. So it's about transportation, it's about people to help move it, it's about people to be able to get the aid.
But if they were to come under attack from Gaddafi forces, let's say, they would respond.
Well, part of what's been going on, and we've seen Valerie Amos, the UN's chief in humanitarian aid, has been busy working with the Gaddafi regime to make sure that aid workers would be allowed in. Again, one of the things I've been calling for with, in my discussions with Ban Ki-moon and with others is to try and get some kind of humanitarian corridor established, a real corridor where you could then use people to help get the aid in, to be able to support the aid workers on the ground, get them in and out, get the aid in. And as we've seen in the last couple of days, also move people who are in great need out. It's a combination of those things you've got to have on the ground to make it work effectively.
But Baroness Ashton, having foreign troops on Libyan soil could be seen as a foreign intervention, even though you say they will be involved only on a humanitarian capacity. This would be still foreign boots on the ground in Libya.
But that's why you only do it within the context of a UN request for support for humanitarian aid. It's not combat troops going into a war situation. It's people with expertise and experience who can go in and support the aid. And that's why it's only done in that way.
This could be again viewed as foreign military presence in a Muslim country, like in Iraq.
It wouldn't be, for the very simple reason that it's under the United Nations request. So it goes through the processes of the United Nations agreeing that it's a necessity. It's unlikely. These things are very difficult. But, you know, as I said at the beginning, it's really important when you're looking at the range of possibilities of how you help people in terrible situations, that you prepare and be ready if asked. But it would only be, and you're right to point it out, on the basis of it being entirely about humanitarian aid getting in, under the UN, under the Security Council, and for the sole purpose of supporting that aid physically in to support the people of Libya.
And when could this mission be deployed? Because as we see, the humanitarian situation is extremely critical in places like Misurata. People need desperate help there. When could this happen?
Well, at the moment, the United Nations are clear that they don't need this kind of help, and for obvious reasons, it's not something you look at lightly. You have to consider very carefully all the options. So at the moment, there's no request in, and they say they're able to get the aid in, which is good news. For us, I wanted to get the planning out of the way because, as you again rightly point to, we don't have a military capacity in the European Union.
Right.
It's made up of
So
member
where would
states.
these forces come from?
They would come from member states who would bring different assets together. So, for example, people have been looking at what different possibilities there might be. I mentioned a port earlier. When the Haiti earthquake happened, one of the problems was actually getting equipment onto a port that's disappeared. So getting machinery, ships that can actually do roll-on, roll-off is very important. So looking at what it might be, that's one example. Do we have the facilities to bring the right kind of shipping into the area to get the aid in? Those sorts of real concrete examples. Range of different options, so if the call comes, we're ready. I would hate us not to be ready, but the call will only come if the UN feels it's absolutely the right thing to do. And that's absolutely right as well.
Okay, meanwhile, we seem to have reached some sort of stalemate in this Libya conflict. Even NATO is being candid in saying that it's difficult to neutralize Gaddafi's air power, Gaddafi's power, basically, and the chairman of the Alliance's military committee has been quoted as saying that significant additional allied contribution is welcome. What is the European Union prepared to do to end this stalemate?
Well, of course, we work closely with NATO, but NATO is now responsible for the imposition of the no-fly zone to, in effect, put into effect the resolution, the Security Council resolution. So they will be looking at how they can best use their assets and what other assets they need, and they will call on countries right across NATO.
Is the European Union still considering arming the rebels as an option?
The European Union has not been in the business of arming
Or
the
France
rebels.
has said this could be an option.
France has talked about, and other countries have talked about, what is necessary for the rebels to move forward. That's not the European Union. Those are individual member states absolutely exercising their rights.
So the EU is not speaking with one voice then?
The European Union speaks with one voice on the issues where the European Union comes together. I've described the humanitarian aid. I've described our response to Libya on many occasions in terms of the medium to long term. The EU is a body, is a group of 27. It's in the business of trying to support countries in transition into the long term. I use the phrase deep democracy. What I mean by that is having the capacity to support countries, not just for 2 years, but for 10 and 20 years. And that's what Europe is really, really good at. Individual member states don't give up their sovereignty to do that. What they do is retain the rights as individual countries to engage and be involved. But we come together where it's, as Europe, we're able to be more effective, and those are the issues I've been looking at.
All right, Baroness Ashton, let's, if I can, get your reaction on the events in Syria. We're seeing escalating violence there, protesters being shot at, the government blaming outside forces for the unrest there. What's the European Union's response to what's been going on in Syria?
Well, we're very worried about what's happening there. As you rightly say, we've seen real violence down in places like Homs today and yesterday. Has to be an end to violence. The first thing is we've got to stop the violence. The government has to take its responsibilities seriously. Lifting the emergency law, something that's promised, needs to happen, and the reforms. The President has been out there saying these are the reforms we will do. We call upon him to actually start to implement them. In all circumstances, dialogue, moving forward, responding to the legitimate wishes of the people.
Well, some of the demands of the people are now for a regime change. It started with calls for reform, but we're increasingly hearing calls for regime change. Would the European Union support a regime change in Syria?
What we say in all circumstances is that the important thing is for the people to determine their own future. Now look, in some countries what we've seen is governments responding to that call, putting in place reforms, moving forward. And the people have gone with that. They've seen that as very positive. Government's responsibility is to respond to its people, to be mindful of what they want and to be clear about their needs. I think what you then hear when people feel it doesn't happen, you then hear that frustration coming through. And one of the reasons I'm a passionate advocate of democracy is that democracy not only allows you to actually elect people, it allows you to say goodbye. Okay,
I'm being told we're running out of time, but I'll ask you one last question because I know you're traveling to Bahrain tomorrow. What's your mission going to be about in Bahrain? We've seen a lot of criticism in places like Iran of the Saudi presence in that country. What are you responding to?
Well, I'm going to be in Abu Dhabi meeting with the King of Bahrain is coming to see me there. We've been in discussion with Bahrain. I've had people out there. Look, the Crown Prince's initiative, very important, very significant in terms of dialogue. Again, we're back to this issue. Dialogue is absolutely at the core of this. Important to keep calm, important to keep moving and building the reforms. And those are the messages I'll be giving to the King of Bahrain, to the Foreign Minister of Bahrain. Essential that they move forward on this right now.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Baroness Lady Ashton, Catherine Ashton here in the studio in Doha with us to talk about the events in the Middle East. And of course, do stay with us on Al Jazeera for our continuing coverage of the Arab awakening. We have reporters across the region providing updates 24 hours a day. And you can get further analysis and updates on our website at aljazeera.net/English. There you'll find exclusive video, in-depth commentary, as well as blogs from Al Jazeera's correspondents on the ground.